All right, so today we're diving into, well, it's a big one. It's World War I.
Yeah, can't get much bigger,
I
really.
mean the numbers, right? Just the sheer scale of it. Almost 10 million military deaths, plus, nearly 7 million civilian deaths. It's just, how does something like that even happen?
It's well, it's the question, isn't it? When you have something, I mean, a cataclysm like that,
Uh,
you kind of look for that one thing, that immediate cause,
right, right.
right? And oftentimes with World War One, people point to, you know, June 28th, 1914,
The assassination.
the assassination, Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Gavrilo Princip, this 19-year-old Serbian nationalist, wanting to unite Bosnia and Herzegovina with Serbia. He pulls the trigger, fires the shots. It's I guess you could almost think of it like a trip and fall. That's the sudden event, and then boom, the consequence.
Right, the flashpoint.
Yeah, the flashpoint.
And then from that, I mean, it's just unbelievable how everything just kicks off.
Yeah.
Austria-Hungary gives Serbia this crazy ultimatum. Then they completely dismiss Serbia's reply, like they were just looking for a fight.
Oh yeah, they were spoiling for it.
So then Austria-Hungary invades Serbia. Russia, obviously, Serbia's ally, they mobilize. Austria-Hungary's not backing down. Germany mobilizes to back them up because of Russia. And then, boom, Germany invades Belgium and France, which of course brings in all those pre-existing alliances. Britain jumps in because, Belgian neutrality. And suddenly, I mean, the whole world is at war. The British Empire, Canada, Australia, India, everybody, even Japan gets pulled in. And then eventually even the U.S. in 1917.
It's terrifying, and it all happens so fast.
Like dominoes.
Well, dominoes, yeah.
So okay, that's the trip. But, what made the fall so bad? What were the underlying conditions, the things that made this one event spiral into this huge war? It couldn't have just been bad luck, right?
It's a great question, right? Because it's like someone with a heart condition, right? Some little thing that would normally be a big deal can just boop.
Yeah, yeah.
And in Europe, in the early 20th century, had a few of those conditions, like underlying things that just made a big war more likely.
Okay.
After that initial shock,
Right.
I think we can kind of point to three big ones. First, there was this wave of nationalism, this really intense nationalism, and that was running right up against these old like dynastic states, empires.
Right.
The second was this whole system of rivalries and alliances, but they weren't like the flexible ones you used to see. They were really rigid, like once you were in, you were in.
And the third.
The third one's industrialization,
Sure.
which, we think of as progress and all that. But yeah, industrialization changed everything about how wars were fought.
So let's unpack that first one, the nationalism and these dynastic states. Now, I know that in a lot of Western Europe, you had nation states.
Yeah.
The country's borders basically matched the national identity of the people.
Yeah, more or less.
But that wasn't the case everywhere, was it?
No, not at all. I mean, you're right. Places like France, Britain, I'd even say Germany to a large extent. They were operating as nation states. They had minorities, sure, but there was this strong sense of, we're French, we're British, we're German. But in Central Europe, especially in the Balkans, it was a whole different ballgame.
Right.
You have these big empires, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and they were, by their nature, multinational. All these different ethnic groups, different languages, all under one ruler, one dynasty.
And that's where the nationalism starts to become a real problem,
Yeah.
right? Especially in Austria-Hungary, it almost seems like by trying to modernize their economy, they accidentally made these nationalist feelings even stronger.
It's almost ironic. They're trying to develop, trying to catch up economically. And in doing so, they help create these more educated, economically active middle and working classes. And not just among the ruling groups, but, among all these different ethnicities, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, Serbs, all of them.
Uh-huh.
And as these groups, they gain more influence, more power, they start to demand more recognition for their own identities, their own cultures. And this is where you get these nationalist movements popping up, not always about, overthrowing the emperor right away, but definitely pushing for more autonomy, more say in how things are run, sometimes even, outright independence.
So the empire's in a real bind here. They want to modernize, which means giving more power to these groups. But by doing that, they risk those groups wanting to break away, which could destroy the whole empire. And then you've got Serbia, and that seemed particularly volatile.
Oh yeah, Serbia was a whole other level of headache. Right. Because, well, there was already an independent Serbia right there on Austria-Hungary's border.
Right.
So for Serbs living inside Austria-Hungary, well, they had this other country, the Serbian country they could look to, this pull, this idea of uniting all Serbs in one nation. It was a powerful force, and it was a direct threat to the empire.
So it was a total no-win for Austria-Hungary. Give in to the Serbs, and maybe everyone else wants more too. Crack down on them, and you're just making the problem worse.
Yeah, and it speaks to this deeper issue, the whole idea of an empire, a dynastic state. It just wasn't working anymore in this new world, the world of national identity, People wanted to be part of a nation, not just subjects of an emperor.
And it wasn't just Austria-Hungary, right? The Ottomans had the same problem.
Or even worse, probably. I mean, the Ottoman Empire was huge, and they had, I don't even know how many different ethnic groups, Balkans, Middle East, North Africa, you name it. And they were all feeling that same pull of nationalism. Greeks, Bulgarians, Albanians, everyone.
And the Ottomans were already, people called them the sick man of Europe, right? They were weak.
Yeah, and that weakness just made everything worse. Throughout the 19th century, you see all these groups in the Balkans getting more and more autonomy, some even breaking away completely. This whole process, people called it Balkanization. And the funny thing is, the Ottomans, they probably lasted longer than they would have because of Europe's own little games.
What do you mean?
Well, the balance of power. Britain and then later Germany, they would often support the Ottomans just to keep Russia or Austria-Hungary from getting too strong in the region. It was all about keeping everyone else in check.
So the Balkans, it's this powder keg, and then you have those Balkan Wars in 1912, 1913. It's like little warning shots before the big one.
Exactly. Those wars, they were all about these competing nationalisms.
Yeah.
And they showed just how easily a small conflict could explode and drag in all the big players.
Okay, so we've got nationalism, the shaky empires. The second thing you mentioned was those rivalries and the alliance system. It seems like the old way of doing things where alliances were more fluid, they could change, that had become a lot more rigid. What happened there?
Yeah, it's a good point. After the Napoleonic Wars, you had this balance of power system. And it was more flexible. Alliances could shift, depending on what was happening, like the Congress of Vienna.
Yeah.
It was supposed to contain France, but then, later they bring France back in to counter Russia.
Yeah.
But by the late 1800s, it had all solidified. You had these two big blocks, heavily armed.
Yeah.
And it's like, once you picked a side, that was it. You had the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy at first.
Right.
And then the triple entente, Britain, France, and Russia.
And that rigidity, that's really key, isn't it? Because it meant that if one country got into trouble, their allies were almost automatically obligated to back them up. No real room for diplomacy. It's almost like those alliances became chains. Instead of keeping the peace, they dragged everyone into war.
Exactly. By 1914, there was almost no room to maneuver. Changing sides or even just staying neutral, it would have been seen as a betrayal, huge consequences. And that's one of the reasons why the July crisis escalated so quickly. Mm-hmm. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, and it's like this mechanism just kicks in. One country after another gets pulled in. Italy did end up switching sides later on, but yeah, that initial rigidity, it was a huge factor.
So you've got Europe. It's basically two armed camps just waiting for something to set it off. And then the third piece you talked about, industrialization. We usually think of that as a good thing, right? Factories, mass production. But obviously it had a huge impact on war.
Yeah, a huge and a pretty dark impact. It allowed countries to produce weapons on a scale that was, unimaginable before. And you could mobilize these huge armies, equip them with all the latest technology.
So it's not just about more guns and more soldiers. Industrialization actually changed how people thought about war, how they planned for it.
Absolutely. Think about a factory. You've got all these specialized workers, all these different parts coming together. Everything has to be planned out, timed perfectly. And that same thinking started to be applied to war. Precision, standardization, mass production, it all became part of military planning.
So the armies themselves became like these giant machines.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Giant, complex machines. Uh-huh. And to make them work, you needed these incredibly detailed plans, timetables for mobilization, logistics, everything.
And the problem with those plans, they were so detailed, so rigid. Once you set things in motion, it was almost impossible to stop, to change course.
You got it. Military leaders, they were convinced that any change to the plan would just lead to chaos. Better to stick to the script, even if it meant going to war over something that, in hindsight, might not have been worth it. It was a commitment to action, whether you wanted it or not.
So let's put it all together.
Yeah.
You've got these rigid military plans. They're based on this industrial way of thinking. And then you've got the rigid alliances, which mean everyone's locked in. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of Austria-Hungary, this fragile empire that's ready to come apart because of nationalism, especially in the Balkans. It's like all the ingredients were there for a massive disaster. Like you said, the Balkans were the stone that started the avalanche.
It's a perfect analogy. And all of these things, they're all connected to bigger trends in European history. Nationalism, it's got its roots in the Enlightenment, in the rise of new social classes. The alliance system, that's the balance of power playing out over centuries. And industrialized warfare, well, that's technology, right? The problem was the leaders back then, they didn't really grasp what it all meant. They didn't see how destructive it could be.
Which brings us to the actual fighting, the human cost. It's crazy, you know? They had all these plans for these quick, decisive wars. And then what happens? Trench warfare. This stalemate that just dragged on and on. It's almost like they forgot the lessons of the American Civil War. You know, that showed how powerful the defense could be with these new weapons.
Yeah, it's a good point. The American Civil War, it was decades earlier, but it really showed how industrial weaponry, repeating rifles, early machine guns, they could really give the defenders an edge. But the Europeans, they kind of ignored that. They were still thinking about these grand offensives, these sweeping movements.
They thought it would be over in a few weeks.
Yeah, that was the popular thinking. Quick, decisive. But then Russia, they mobilized much faster than anyone expected. I mean, their army wasn't as good.
Yeah.
You know, less industrialized, leadership problems. They even used unencrypted radio communications, which is just, I mean, you can't make that up.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. But even though they were flawed, the Russians, they did manage to tie up a lot of German troops.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually helped the French hold on, you know, stop the Germans from that knockout blow they were hoping for.
So Russia being kind of bad at war actually helped.
In a way, yeah, it helped throw off the Schlieffen Plan, which was that big German plan to knock France out quickly. So the German advance stalled, and both sides, they started digging in. And then you get this race to the sea where they're both trying to outflank each other, you know, and the result is these trench systems that just stretched for miles and miles, from Switzerland all the way to the English Channel.
And then it's in those trenches that you really see the full horror of industrial warfare.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you had these weapons, the machine gun especially, that were just devastating to attacking infantry.
Yeah, you could just mow down waves of men.
A single machine gun in the right spot with interlocking fields of fire, you know, covering every angle, it could wipe out thousands. And both sides had them, lots of them. So yeah, it became a stalemate. Neither side could attack effectively. And so they just dug in deeper, built more elaborate defenses, barbed wire, backup trenches, supply lines, the whole 9 yards.
No man's land. Just that name, it just evokes this image of utter desolation, right? Just this empty strip of land between the trenches, swept by gunfire, artillery. And the generals, it's like they just kept throwing men into these attacks, these frontal assaults against these defenses that were almost impossible to break.
It's hard to grasp, you know, the sheer futility of it. But the generals, they just kept doing it, wave after wave. Maybe they thought that if they just threw enough men at the problem, something would break. But it never did. And the casualty rates, I mean, they were astronomical. And then on top of all that, you have these new technologies, poison gas.
Yeah, that's a whole other level of awful. It was the Germans who used it first, but then everyone else started doing it too. And it's not like it really won any battles. It was just about inflicting more pain, more casualties.
Mustard gas, that was the really bad one. Blistering, lung damage. If you breathed it in, it was basically, you know, you drowned in your own fluids.
Yeah.
Horrible. The only good thing, I guess, is that both sides developed gas masks pretty quickly. Even for horses, they had gas masks. So it didn't really give anyone an advantage in the end. It just made things more horrible for everyone. Although, you know, there's this weird little side note, all that gas, it actually led to some big advances in meteorology. Yeah, weather forecasting. Yeah. Suddenly knowing which way the wind was blowing, that became really important.
Right. So you could avoid gassing your own troops.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, you look at a battle like Verdun, 1916, that really shows you the industrial scale of death. Millions of artillery shells, the whole landscape just obliterated. And all for nothing. Hundreds of thousands of casualties. No real gains for either side. All quiet on the Western Front. That phrase, it's chilling, isn't it?
It's just this image of this pointless slaughter. And it's all driven by industry, right? The ability to just keep producing more and more weapons, more and more shells.
Exactly. No pre-industrial society could have sustained that level of killing. It was the industrial capacity of these nations that allowed the war to drag on for so long.
And it finally ended with Germany collapsing. Although, it's interesting, the French army almost mutinied in 1917, and somehow the Germans didn't realize how bad it was. They could have maybe won if they'd known.
Yeah, that was a close one. But in the end, it was the German economy that couldn't keep up. And then, the mutinies in their own ranks. So November 1918, it's over. But then, of course, you have the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. And that created a whole new set of problems.
Especially the way Germany was treated.
Yeah, very harsh.
So the war ends, and the map of Europe, it's completely redrawn. 4 empires gone: German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Ottoman. And in their place, all these new countries pop up: Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. And it wasn't just Europe, right? The Middle East, too.
Oh, yeah. The Ottoman Empire, it had controlled all these Arab lands,
Yeah.
And when it collapsed, Britain and France, they carved it up, divided it between themselves. We called them mandates. But, that just fueled Arab nationalism. They were supposed to be helping these areas become independent, but they weren't really in any hurry. And then you had Palestine. The British, they made all these promises to the Arabs, to the Jews. Obviously, they couldn't keep them all.
Yeah.
And that set the stage for a lot of the conflict we see in that region, even today.
It's still going on.
Yeah. And then you had Ireland. They finally got their independence from Britain, who, after the war, they were just exhausted.
So it wasn't just about changing borders. World War I, it basically ended Europe's dominance of the world.
Yeah, it was a huge shift. They'd been on top for centuries, diplomatically, economically.
Yeah.
But after the war, that was over. Their empires were weakening. New powers were rising. The U.S., Japan, Britain. They went from being the world's banker to being a debtor nation. It was a huge change.
And then there's the human cost. I mean, the numbers are just staggering. Millions dead, millions more wounded. Right. And not just the soldiers, right? Civilians, too.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to grasp the scale of it. Over 9 million soldiers dead, countless more with, horrific injuries, physical and psychological. And the impact on families, on society as a whole. I mean, you had entire generations of men just wiped out. And that had a huge impact on demographics, on population growth.
Right.
And then, of course, you have the Spanish flu. That pandemic in 1919, 1920, it killed, estimates are as high as 50 million people worldwide.
Yeah.
And the war, it definitely made it worse. People were weakened, malnourished, more susceptible to disease.
So the war didn't just kill people directly. It also created the conditions for even more death.
Yeah, it's pretty grim. And then there's the psychological impact. Before the war, there was this idea of progress, this belief that humanity was, getting better all the time.
Yeah.
But the war, it really shattered that. All that science, all that technology, it had just been turned into these tools of mass killing.
Yeah, all those things that were supposed to make life better, they ended up causing this incredible suffering.
It was a real crisis of faith in progress, in rationality. It's no coincidence that after the war, you see someone like Freud becoming so popular, with his ideas about the dark side of human nature, the irrational drive.
So the war, it wasn't just about armies and battles. It changed how people thought about the world, about humanity itself.
Yeah, and not for the better. It's like all these European powers, they were so busy trying to destroy each other that they ended up destroying themselves in the process. They lost their global dominance, they lost millions of their own people, and they lost that sense of optimism, that belief in progress.
It's almost like they tripped and fell and they took the whole world down with them.
Yeah, it's a pretty good analogy.
So we started with that assassination in Sarajevo, and we've looked at all these forces that were already in motion: nationalism, alliances, industrialization, and they all came together to create this perfect storm, this global conflict that reshaped the world, and not in a good way.
It's a complex story,
yeah,
but it's one that we need to understand because it shows how these big historical trends can have these unintended, these catastrophic consequences.
Yeah, and it leaves us with some big questions to think about, like, how did all those things that we saw as progress, how did they become the tools of such destruction? And what does that tell us about progress itself, about the relationship between progress and conflict? It's something to think about, that's for sure.
It is, and it's something that, unfortunately, is still relevant today.
Yeah. All right, well, that's World War I. A lot to unpack there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.